What's going on, guys? Stepping here, S&E's Garage. I know a lot of you have actually subscribed to my channel due to some of my Hyundai content, and I wanted to try to get back into some Hyundai stuff. So as you guys may know, if you've watched my other videos, I, up until April of this year, was a Platinum Master Certified Hyundai technician, which basically means that I completed all the levels of training that Hyundai offers, and I then competed in the Platinum Challenge. That was on December 12th of 2019, where they more or less, they give me a car or a group of cars that have different bugs and different issues that I have to then go in and diagnose and repair. It definitely was not an easy task, but it was a lot of fun. So with that being said, I do know most Hyundai products inside out and backwards, and off the top of my head, I have so much stuff in my head that about these cars that I don't think I'll ever forget it. But what I wanted to get into today was basically a used car buyer's guide for the YF Sonata. The YF Sonata being the 2011 through 2014 generation. Right now, they came out in 2011, so they're coming up on 10 years old in their earliest form. And they're really getting kind of cheap, you know, $4,000, $5,000, $6,000, depending on where you're looking and what kind of mileage they have. And a lot of you guys may be looking at them for maybe your first car, or maybe a beater to, you know, commute back and forth to work or just drive around town in. And I wanted to make this video to kind of give you guys an idea of what you should be looking for, what you should be looking out for, and what issues you should keep in the back of your mind that the car will almost definitely at some point have if it hasn't had them already. Alright, so we're probably going to divide this video into sections. We're gonna touch on the body, steering, suspension. We're going to get into the engine, transmission, body electrical, HVAC, heating, cooling, things like that. So with that being said, let's get right into it. So first and foremost, let's address the giant elephant in the room when it comes to the Hyundai Sonata. Yes, they have serious engine problems, whether you have the 2.0 turbo or the 2.4. There have been various recalls on this engine for rod bearing failure. They do come with a lifetime warranty now, assuming that the car has had the 953 PCM update completed. That is very important. If you buy one of these that has not had that recall done, get it done as soon as possible, because Hyundai will not warranty the engine if it fails without that 953 engine protection mode software installed. I'm not sure why they're doing it that way, but that's the way it is. If you don't have that TSB or recall performed, that's not going to be covered. So the engines are not very reliable in this car, so be on the lookout for that. When you go to buy one, start it up, rev it up, you know, maybe 2,000, 3,000, 2,500 RPM, and just hold it there. You're going to want to listen. If you hear any type of a rattle, any type of a knock, anything like that, walk away from it and go look at a different one. Now you can check out my other video of the engine failure timeline if you kind of wanted a little bit of info on what the 953 is. But it actually more or less installs what's called an engine protection mode into the engine control module. Now with that, it'll throw a P1326 NOx sensor range performance code. And that code can either mean one or two things. It could be a NOx sensor, it can be a software update, or it can need an engine. So it's actually one of three things if you want to think about it that way. But that kind of segues into the whole engine failure thing. So yeah, just be on the lookout for that. The check engine light will be flashing, and the car will have absolutely no power if that is an issue on a car you're looking at. Now, do keep in mind that both of the engine choices in the 2011 to 2014 Sonata are a gasoline direct injection engine. With that comes a little more maintenance. You are going to have to run a GDI service or an induction service every 25,000, 30,000 miles, give or take, just to keep this thing running at its optimal performance. If you do not, you can induce some carbon buildup on the back of those intake valves, and what are you doing? That can lead to some problems. So just keep that in the back of your mind. If the previous owner didn't keep up with it, you may have some carbon buildup that could be hurting performance and or fuel economy. Another thing I wanted to talk about engine-wise in these cars is a part that I've personally replaced several times in several Sonatas, and that would be the oil cooler. The oil cooler on these Sonatas is a sandwich plate design, is what they call it. So you have a port on the engine for an oil filter, and they sandwich the oil cooler, and then your oil filter screws into that. So the oil filter is a coolant to oil cooler. It's not air to oil, so it's cooled by engine coolant. And what happens when they fail is your engine oil is pressurized at a much higher pressure than the coolant. So the car will actually empty the crankcase. It'll pump all of the oil in the engine into the cooling system and will turn your coolant into like a giant milkshake. Both of the cars that I had this happen to were well out of warranty. They were up in the 100,000 mile range. So if you are buying one of these, make sure that you check the coolant reservoir. Make sure the coolant looks nice and clean. If it's a little milky, I would steer away from it. Like I said, I've personally in my tenure at Hyundai done 2 or 3 of them. And there have been several others in the shop. It's enough to where I know of it and I know to look out for it. So definitely keep an eye out for that. So the next 2 issues I want to touch on as far as the engine is concerned is related to the turbo vehicles and the turbo vehicles only, that being the 2.0 turbo. There are 2 conditions that are rather common in these cars that can cause a low power issue. First and foremost being the electronic wastegate actuator. These cars use an electronic wastegate. It is not vacuum operated, and they do that so they can control boost pressure a little bit better. What actually happens is the position sensor that's built into that electronic wastegate actuator can actually fail. And when it fails, fail-safe is to hold the wastegate open so the car can't build boost. And a low compression 2-liter engine without boost isn't going to make a whole lot of power, and it is very obvious when they fail. There is a TSB that can be performed to adjust the wastegate rod, but many times these cars, once they get some miles on them, that wastegate rod is either seized due to salt and corrosion, or the car will come back a month later with the same codes after you adjust it. So in the dealership, once we started getting those codes, we would, if they were up in mileage, we would recommend replacing that electronic wastegate actuator. And when we did replace it, we would put the new one on and then make sure that the voltage for the new one was within specification before we sent it out the door. The second issue I want to touch on that can cause reduced power in the turbocharged vehicles is the front mount intercooler. The front mount intercooler is actually mounted vertically on the driver's side under the front bumper. It's on the same side as the transmission. I'll touch on how I remember that later. But what can happen is, especially in the salt belt, if you live in a state where they use salt to treat the roads, that salt actually sits where the lower part of the tank meets the fins for the intercooler and oxidizes the aluminum. And what happens is that actually the lower tank separates from the fins and creates what's called a boost leak. When that happens, you will hear some pretty weird turbo noises. It'll whistle, it'll do all kinds of things. A lot of times they will throw a turbo under boost code, and you'll notice a very reduced power output out of the car. One other thing that I think is worth mentioning that I've seen a handful of times, this was more on cars that weren't maintained very well. If you open the oil cap and there's some sludge on it, I would steer away from that car. What can actually happen is the feed line for the turbocharger can actually get clogged with sludge. And when that happens, the turbocharger no longer gets lubrication and it can actually seize. And when they seize, what usually happens is the shaft where the turbine and the impeller are connected to actually splits. And a lot of the times it'll throw the turbine on the hot side of the turbo back into the catalytic converter, which is It's actually pretty spectacular when you pull them apart. Like I said, I've really only seen that on cars that were not well maintained though, so if you have a car that has a good maintenance history, I would not worry too much about that. So now that we've more or less covered the most common failures that I've seen engine-wise on these cars, we're going to move over to the transmission and the driveline. Now the transmissions on these cars are actually relatively stout. I don't think I've ever replaced a transmission in a 2011 to a 2014 Hyundai Sonata. And believe me, I've been inside of a lot of these cars. One problem that these transmissions do have though, there is actually a technical service bulletin for this issue, is the transmission temperature harness has the transmission temperature sensor built into it. And what happens is that transmission temperature sensor can fail, and it throws several different codes. I want to say P0711 might be one of them, circuit range performance of the transmission temperature sensor. And when this fails, you'll usually, like I said, get a check engine light, but sometimes you won't if it's an intermittent failure. But what you will notice is when you start your car and you go to throw it in reverse or drive, the thing pounds real hard into gear, and also your 1-2 shift when you when you take off and start driving will really give you a hard thud. You'll know when something's going on with it. It's very important that when this happens, you do not continue to drive the car like that, because it will eventually cause damage to the transmission. But like I said, it's a well-known issue. Hyundai knows about it. There's a service campaign out for it. And a lot of these issues that I'm going to talk about today are actually covered by some sort of a service bulletin. So if the car was well maintained by the dealership, there's a good chance that most of these TSBs, recalls, issues like that have been ironed out over the years, but it's just something you need to be on the lookout for. So another common issue with these drive lines happens to be CV axles, or axle shafts. A lot of times, the axle, whether it be the left or the right, will start clicking when you go to turn full lock left or right. When you go to check the axles, you won't feel any play in them, and 9 times out of 10, the boots won't be ripped. You can drive the car like this for as long as you'd like until it starts getting worse, but I have done my fair share of axles in these cars. This is another thing that Hyundai actually released a service bulletin for, where they actually had us replace half of the axle, where we basically rebuilt the axle. These were only cars that it happened to that were under warranty. If they were out of warranty, they got a whole axle shaft. So be on the lookout for that if you're buying one. When you go to drive it, just make sure you get in it. You go, bring it to an open parking lot, go lock to lock and accelerate while you're doing it. Listen for any clicking. If you do hear clicking, the car probably needs axles. Alright, so now that we've touched on the axles, what do the axles bolt to? They bolt to the hub, which is connected to the wheel bearing. We have seen our fair share of Hyundai Sonatas with bad wheel bearings. Unfortunately, these wheel bearings are pressed in, and they are held in by a snap ring. Most of the time, that snap ring is completely rotted and rusted, and I've broken several hubs trying to press old wheel bearings out of these things. So be on the lookout for that. If the car's making a roaring noise, that gets worse when you're turning left or right from the front end. It's probably going to need wheel bearings. In order to replace them, like I said, they're pressing, so you have to remove the whole hub, set it up in a press. It's rather expensive, and it's definitely not something you're going to want to have to do on a car that you just bought. So if you're buying one, make sure you drive it. Like I said in my previous clip, left, right, full lock, drive the car, get it up to speed, make sure those wheel bearings aren't making noise. So we got engine done, we got transmission and driveline done. We're going to go ahead, we're going to go to steering and suspension. Now these cars do have several steering and suspension issues that are rather common, so this might be a little bit of a lengthy section. I'm just going to get that out of the way. So stay tuned, we'll get right into it. So the first and most prominent issue that these cars have in their steering system would be what's called the steering coupler. This is a little rubber bushing or coupler, whatever you want to call it, that is in the steering column. And what this does is it connects the electronic power steering motor to the column. It's literally about this big. The part's not any more than $5, but the labor is rather intensive. You got to drop the steering column to replace it. Now, when you get into one of these cars, if you're looking at buying it, start the car, grab the steering wheel, go left to right really fast. You'll know if it's bad. It'll sound like metal banging together in the steering column. Just beware. Hyundai did extend that under the powertrain warranty. It is covered under the 10-year, 100,000-mile warranty. Just be on the lookout for it, because if the car's out of warranty, it might be a little pricey for you to replace that yourself. Another issue I wanted to touch on in the steering system, I don't really know if I would consider this completely steering related. This is more airbag issue. But the clock spring is actually what connects the steering wheel to the steering column and allows you to turn the wheel without having wires going through the column. It's what enables you to have your radio steering wheel controls and so forth. What actually happens with them is the wires for the airbag, whether it be stage 1 or stage 2, actually fail and sets the airbag light on. This is another issue that Hyundai did issue a warranty extension on. I don't remember the specifics on it, so if you do have one of these cars with the airbag light on, before you bring it to a private shop, bring it to the dealer first, see if it's covered, because it might be 10 years unlimited mileage. Like I said, don't quote me on that. I don't remember. But if you are buying one of these, make sure when you start the car, the airbag light comes on and then turns off. If it stays on, you have an issue somewhere in the airbag system, and it's usually going to be that clock spring, which is, like I said, is right behind the steering wheel. The next thing I want to touch on in the steering and suspension system on these cars happens to be the front struts. Not so much the struts as the coil springs. If you live in the Salt Belt especially, the springs on these cars, the 11 to 14 YF Sonatas, are known for fracturing. And when they fracture, they can actually send a part of the spring straight into your tire and pop your tire. And it's a really bad time. I can't even tell you how many of these that I've seen. They made good on most of them by replacing the springs, but some of them, the struts were also damaged while this happened. So if you are buying one of these, just make sure you bring a flashlight with you and peek up into that wheel well and just look at the coil spring. If they break, they're going to break on the bottom half of the spring, where the bottom of the spring sits on the strut. And like I said, what will happen is that spring, when it breaks, can go into the tire. And what will also happen is it'll uncoil itself and start walking down the strut. It's crazy, believe me, but it happens. So, like I said, make sure if you're buying one of these, look under the front wheel wells with a flashlight. Make sure those struts aren't broken. And also, just take a look at the car when it's sitting on the road. Make sure it's, it's sitting straight. If it's, sitting cockeyed, you definitely have something going on in the suspension, so be mindful of that. While we're on the front suspension, I do feel it's worth mentioning that the sway bar end links, which basically connect each front strut to the sway bar to prevent the body from rolling, they are a common failure point. When these go bad, it'll quite literally sound like the front of your car is getting ready to fall apart, because every time you hit a bump and that sway bar moves, the play in that end link is going to, make that ball and socket joint move around, and it's a very unpleasant sound. So if you have one of these, or if you're going to buy one, make sure you take it on like an uneven road, uneven pavement, and hit some bumps. Make sure you don't hear any abnormal clunking or banging, because that's probably going to be your culprit. So now we're going to move over to the back of the car, still in steering and suspension. The rear tires on these cars like to get out of alignment as the car ages, because the springs start to sag. And on the back of these cars, you can adjust toe and camber. So what happens is the inside of the back tires will actually get what we call scalloped. They'll start to have little bumps on them. And if you rotate your tires from back to front, you'll start hearing some noise. And we actually had to unrotate a lot of people's tires because of that issue. The good thing is, most of the time, this issue can be resolved by a new set of tires and a wheel alignment. You align those back wheels, get them back into alignment, tracking straight, both toe and camber, get them straight, and your new tires will wear just fine. But, and this is a very big but, if you live in the Salt Belt, 9 times out of 10, both of those rear adjustments end up being seized. And to replace those adjustment cams, you have to replace the rear control arms and all of the hardware. And the way you replace them is you quite literally have to sawzall them out of the car. I've done a ton of them. They are not fun, nor are they cheap. So if you're buying one of these, take a look at the back tires, make sure they're not wearing funny. If they're wearing funny, keep in mind that you're probably going to need an alignment. But if you're in the salt belt, like I said, where they, if you're in an area where they salt the roads in the winter, just keep in the back of your mind that you might not be able to get it aligned without replacing those rear control arms. And like I said, it's not something that's going to be cheap or easy. So now we're going to move on to the body of the car, and I'm going to include headlights, taillights, things like that in the body. I'm also going to include paint in that. First and foremost, if you're buying one of these cars used, don't buy a white one. Hyundai's white paint on almost all of their models likes to self-evacuate from the car, meaning you'll be driving down the road, and mainly on the front hood line, where the front roof line, where the roof meets the windshield, and on the front hood, where the hood meets the bumper, quite literally, the paint will just start flaking and flying off of the car. Super common. Hyundai repaired a lot of those cars under warranty, but if you're looking at one of these that's an 11 to 14, it is probably out of warranty by now. So if it's white, personally, I would stay away from it. But if you are going to buy a white one, just take a good look at the paint right where like I said, where the roof meets the windshield, and on the front hood, and make sure you don't see any chips or peels, because once you get a rock chip and a little bit of moisture or a little bit of dirt gets under there, it speeds that process up, and like I said, quite literally, the paint will peel right. Another thing I wanted to touch on is the front bumper clips on these cars, where the front bumper connects to the front fender. I don't know why this is the case, but they are very fragile. It doesn't take much if somebody that had the car before you, or even yourself, just happened to bump a curb with your front, under your front bumper, or hit one of those parking spot stops. The clips like to just break, and you'll see that the front bumper actually does not sit flush with the fender anymore. And the only correct way to replace that is to replace the bumper. So be mindful of that. Take a good look around the car. Make sure none of those clips are broken, because it could get expensive. Alright, so another thing I want to talk about with these cars is light bulbs, the tail lights, marker lights, running lights, headlights. These cars eat light bulbs like you wouldn't believe. Anytime one of these cars was in the shop, it was guaranteed to have at least 1 or 2 bulbs out. Hyundai actually, for the 2015 Sonata, they improved the smart junction box with a new device. I forget exactly what they called it, but it more or less uses pulse width modulation to keep the voltage going to the bulbs at exactly 12.6 volts. Because with the 11 to 14 Sonatas, they get full system voltage. Your alternator can put almost out, up to 15 volts. In certain cases, if your battery's discharged 14.5, 14.8. So if you're sending that kind of power into your bulbs, they're gonna blow faster. And what actually happened with a lot of these cars is the rear tail light sockets would actually melt. So you go to replace your bulb, and the socket would not clip back in because it is deformed from melting. And the only way to replace, or to fix that, is replace the whole tail light assembly, which is asinine. So just be on the lookout for that. Like I said, whether it be headlights, tail lights, marker lights, brake lights, these things eat lights like you wouldn't believe. So if you're buying one of these, give it a good once around, check the bulbs, pop the trunk, make sure that the tail lights are not melted where the bulb goes in, because if they're melted, you're going to have a real hard time getting your bulb back in, and you're going to have to spend a couple $100 on a new tail light. Alright, so now that we've covered all of that stuff, we're going to move on to the HVAC, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. I wanted to start with the compressor because it's the most forward part on these cars that have issues. These are not the common compressor that you would find in an older car. There is no compressor clutch. These are called swash plate compressors. They are always spinning. Basically what happens is there's a little electronic valve in that compressor that is modulated by voltage. And the reason they do it this way is they can control exactly how much that compressor comes on instead of full on and full off. But what happens is that valve in the compressor goes bad. And when that goes bad, the compressor will no longer work. For a while, we were just putting compressors in them at the tune of $1,500 a pop before labor. That was just a part. I believe Hyundai now has that valve available that you can replace. I don't remember how much it is. Just keep that in the back of your mind. If you're getting one of these, start it up, turn the air conditioning on, make sure it blows nice and cold. If it doesn't, hopefully it just needs a recharge, but just keep in mind that it could be a compressor or that electronic control valve that's inside of the compressor causing the problem. Now, the AC system in the 11 to 14 Hyundai Sonata is also known for several R134A Freon leaks. The most common being the discharge hose on the compressor. It's a little rubber hose that comes off the compressor, and it basically makes a U and goes up onto the passenger side frame rail. If you're buying one of these, pop the hood and look at the hoses going to the compressor. If they are covered in like a black dirt, that hose is definitely leaking, because what happens is the pad oil leaks out of those hoses with the Freon, and then dirt sticks to them. It's a super common telltale. I sold so many of those hoses on cars where the AC was still working just because I knew it was leaking, and every single time I've sold one of those hoses, because of that, it was low on Freon. So had they have gone another month or two without me seeing that on the multi-point inspection, they would have been right back in for an air conditioning complaint. So just keep that in mind. Look at those hoses on the air conditioner. Make sure they're not covered in black grease or black dirt or anything like that, because if they are, they're leaking. Now, the last common problem that I want to talk about on the HVAC system on these cars is actually a very serious one that, if you don't catch while it's under warranty, is super expensive. There is a separator plate in the HVAC control box on these cars that it basically separates the two halves of the HVAC control box. And what happens is, over time, that separator plate warps, and when you go to change the mode on your air conditioner, it'll actually get stuck. And most of the time it gets stuck in defrost, because defrost is the most upsetting on those flaps, if that makes sense. And when you go to take it off the frost, you'll just hear click, 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 click. Now, the way to diagnose that is you take the mode actuator off and you try to move the flap by hand. If the flap does not move, you're pulling the dashboard out of that car, you're separating the HVAC box, and you're replacing that separator plate. Out of warranty, that is a super expensive job. So if you're buying one of these, make sure you run it through all the modes, make sure the frost works, make sure, face works, feet works, head, shoulders, knees, and toes. Make sure everything's blowing where it's supposed to be blowing, because if it's not, that can be a super expensive repair. Alright guys, so that about sums it up. If you're looking for an 11 to 14 YF Sonata, my advice to you is don't buy one. But if you are going to buy one, you found a good deal, you can't pass it up, and you just need a cheap car to get you around, just keep an eye out for the things that I've mentioned. Most of them are rather common, and most of them do have some sort of a service bulletin or campaign out because of how common they are. So with that being said, please like, share, and subscribe. If you guys with Hyundais have any other videos you'd like me to cover, any other models you'd like me to cover, drop a comment in the comment section below. Let me know. Like I said, I know most of these cars inside out and backwards up until April. So please, like I said, like, share, subscribe. We'll see you next time.